I'm Sharon Thompson-Schill, if you haven't met me yet, one of the organizers, and I'm very happy to introduce another one of the organizers, one of the real organizers who did all the work, Moritz, who is speaking for the first time here, right?
Yeah.
Yes, even though he's been coming for a while. So conceptual and structural representations in the Action Observation Network.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sharon, for introducing. But actually, you've forgotten the quotation marks. So they are actually the most important part of the title. And I will tell you in a second why. Okay, so the Action Observation Network. So what is it? The Action Observation Network is commonly referred to as the network of brain regions involved in action, observation, and recognition of actions such as running, opening a door, or greeting someone. Now, this network does not really form a continuous pathway, not really a stream like the ventral watt stream for object recognition. Rather, it is much more widespread, and it comprises separate regions in the lateral occipital temporal cortex, the parietal cortex. So today we have learned already actually a lot about these two important subregions, namely the superior parietal lobe and the anterior inferior parietal lobe. And finally, the premotor cortex. Now, what is the role of these regions in action recognition? And surprisingly, this is still a matter of debate. Now, to approach the problem, we should start by asking what steps are actually needed for action recognition. So, in general, recognition can be defined as the process enabling the match of a percept with the memory content, which typically requires the perceptual analysis of a stimulus and conceptual access, of the access of more general conceptual knowledge. Now, action recognition kind of builds on the recognition of objects. So we first have to recognize body parts, involved objects or tools, and even other cues like additional persons in the case of social actions or scene elements. So a simple, straightforward model could start with the recognition of objects, followed by a more detailed analysis of aspects like body postures and movements. And somehow these elements are then integrated to access the conceptual stage, the meaning of peeling. Now, this conceptual level may then serve as the basis for further downstream functions, for example, inferring underlying motives and intentions of the action, for example, that the person is going to eat the apple, or to plan and select putative reactions or social learning. So, how do these different processing stages map onto the action observation network? Now, in my talk, I will mainly focus on the core recognition process, that is, how the brain manages to access the conceptual stage. So that's the first question I would like to address today. Now, while there's general agreement that the posterior part of LOTC serves kind of an entry point to action recognition, for example, it contains several well-described visual areas, such as the human motion area, the axis-stride body area, and the lateral occipital complex, which is associated with object shape recognition. The role of more anterior regions, in particular frontoparietal cortex, is much less clear. So in the context of action observation and recognition, these areas are more associated with the sensory motor system, as we have learned already today. So some even have claimed that activation of motor representations that correspond to the observed action is actually necessary for action recognition. So I think I don't say anything too offensive if I say that this is a relatively outdated view. But now also other proposals have been claiming that this region is important for the selection and planning of motor reactions and learning. Now, so I don't want to discuss this theory in detail, but what I want to highlight is that there are also non-body, non-motor related functions important for action recognition. which are equally associated with frontoparietal cortex. For example, recognizing actions like someone catching a ball requires visuospatial and temporal processing, so such as attending to and tracking action-relevant elements. Action observation also involves predicting how actions unfold, and at least the recognition of goal-directed actions involves a physical understanding of, for example, how effectors, for example, a hand or a tool, exert a force to induce a change in the target object. Now, these aspects are important not only for the recognition of actions, but also for the recognition of dynamic events in general. And it is remarkable, actually, that the network that is involved for action recognition is very similar to the network that you obtain when people, for example, reason about physical events. So an important question is therefore, which regions of the action observation network are actually action-specific, and which regions would actually be recruited in general for dynamic events. And that's what I will address in the second part today. Now, taking this idea to an extreme, we might even ask whether we need body movements and concrete objects at all. So here's a famous animation that some of you might know already by 𝗁𝗁 and CIMeC, which just shows the movement of geometric shapes. Is there actually an echo? So should I? Turn that mic off. This one is off. It is? Yeah. So perhaps you can just make this a bit weaker. I don't know. Let me just see if this is getting better. So yeah, so when we look at this animation, we do not only automatically ascribe animacy to these shapes, but we also effortlessly recognize the underlying actions, right? So we see actions like opening, chasing, kissing, even perception actions like peeking and so on. Now, how is this possible? Well, so we can clearly, we can't rely on the recognition of real objects. So we don't see persons and their typical movements. So one could argue perhaps there's a second separate mechanism, a separate pathway for recognizing such stimuli. Now, I would argue that this is unlikely because we so effortlessly and automatically activate the action concept that it seems that we have already a system that is specialized for recognizing the underlying actions. So, but then, if not, how do we integrate these extreme examples in an action recognition framework? Now, the only available cues in this example are the specific visuospatial relations between the moving agents and certain scene elements, and also how these relations change over time. And I argue that the specific interplay of these temporal spatial relations is usually characteristic for specific actions, for actions like opening or chasing and so on. So I will develop this idea further later. So what I propose is that action recognition relies on perceptually general, what I call structural representations that capture the spatial and temporal relations between action-relevant elements. So, and that's what I will address in the last part of my talk. Okay, so how can we address these questions? So remember that the basic goal is to isolate from an action, which is, of course, a very complex stimulus with a lot of different features, just the representation of interest. So broadly speaking, so the general approach is very similar across the studies that I will present you today. So we scan participants with fMRI while they observe short videos of actions, for example, kicking a ball, while they do a very basic catch-try task just to ensure they pay attention to our stimuli. And then in different experiments, we use other kinds of stimuli that match the action video in terms of just the level of representation we are interested in. So, and this allows us to isolate that component of interest. So for example, we train a classifier on action videos and then test it on written descriptions of the same action and vice versa. And this should isolate a modality-independent conceptual representation of the action. Now, the same we can do with other stimuli. For example, we can show videos of inanimate object events, like a ball hitting against another ball, to isolate an agency general representation of events. Or hide and symbol-like animations to isolate structural representations. Okay, so now let's get started. Let's start with the first question. Which regions of the action observation network encode actions at the conceptual stage? Now, in a series of fMRI studies, we tested 3 criteria for conceptual representation. So first, an action concept should generalize across different action exemplars, like opening a bottle, opening a door, or opening a trash bin. Second, an action concept should generalize across different input modalities or stimulus formats. For example, it should respond to both observing an action, like opening a bottle, and to a verbal description of that action. And third, the representations of action concepts should be organized following certain semantic principles. So it should group actions with similar types of outcomes or effects in the world, for example, actions that aim at manipulating objects, communication, or a change in location. So let's start with the first criterion. Which action observation network regions generalize across perceptually different action exemplars? So we scanned participants while they observed videos of actions, like opening and closing a bottle. Then we extracted neural activation patterns associated with these actions, and then trained a classifier to distinguish these activation patterns. So now, using a different stimulus set, where we showed actions that involve different objects, we again now extracted the activation patterns and tested the classifier on its ability to discriminate these actions. So these actions involve a different object and are carried out with different hand movements. And if there is a common representation that encodes these actions at an exemplar general level, the activation patterns associated with these exemplars should be similar. And this should obviously result in successful classification. So here are the results. The areas in blue show the decoding across actions that involve different objects. And as you can see, only a subset of the action observation network, in particular the left LOTC and bilateral AIPL, encode action representations at an exemplar general level. So we have replicated this finding many times, so I just now want to focus on one additional stimulus set, namely where we even decoded actions across different effectors. So like opening a door with the hand generalizes to opening a trash bin with the foot. So it's a perceptually highly general representation that we target here. Now let's move on to the second criterion. Action concepts should generalize across input modality. So we used the same cross-decoding approach, so this time with a larger set of 8 actions. And again, so we trained the classifier to discriminate activation patterns associated with observing the videos of actions, and then we tested the classifier on activation patterns associated with reading short sentences. For example, the girl takes the box, opens the bottle, and so on. So decoding accuracies above chance indicate that a region encodes action representations that can be activated independently of the stimulus modality. Here's what we found. Only the left anterior LOTC encodes action representations that generalize across observed actions and written descriptions. So this pattern is in strong contrast to the decoding of just action videos, or to the decoding of sentences, which reveal much more widespread effects, including also frontoparietal cortex. Now, one important aspect that I want to highlight here of the difference between the cross-modal and the within session decoding is that it actually argues against an interpretation that the cross-modal decoding is driven by visual imagery, for example, or by verbalization, because in that case, we would expect effects for the cross-modal decoding that resemble much more the action video decoding or the sentence decoding. Now, we can also investigate the underlying representational organization in the left LO2C. So for this, we extracted the cross-modal classification matrix from that region and entered it into a representational similarity analysis. And this revealed that the organization of the cross-modal representations in LO2C can be explained by action-related semantic dimensions. Most importantly, whether an action is directed toward persons or not, or involves objects, or are similar in terms of more complex semantic relations. And this is over and above other control models. Now, to wrap up these studies, while anterior IPL generalizes across perceptually highly diverse action exemplars, only the left anterior LOTC fulfills all three criteria for conceptual representation. We therefore conclude that this region is a key stage for representing the meaning of actions at an abstract level, which is also in line with studies using different approaches, such as neuropsychology and TMS. Now, what we can do is also to investigate the topography of action representations in the left LOTC. For this, we ran a representational similarity analysis along a vector from dorsal to ventral LOTC. And what we found was that person-directedness is represented more dorsally in LOTC, whereas object-directedness is represented more ventrally. Now, interestingly, this action topography is aligned also with the topography of object representations in adjacent, more interior areas in LOTC that I've just talked about, for example, the EBA. So specifically, the animate-inanimate distinction that segregates body parts, faces, and their movements, so these representations are found more dorsally, from tools and other inanimate objects which are represented more ventrally in the posterior LOTC. So this seems to reflect the category-specific relations between actions and involved objects. So to make an example, so the recognition of social, of person-directed actions relies mostly on the analysis of body-related information, such as person orientation or gestures and facial expressions. By contrast, the recognition of object-directed actions relies more on the processing of inanimate objects, obviously, such as tools and manipulable objects. So, in other words, category-specific object representations in posterior LOTC might function as precursors for action concepts in anterior LOTC. Now, this idea of a gradient from more perceptual to conceptual representations is actually in line with evidence for a structurally defined third lateral pathway in the LOTC. And here we argue that the main function of this pathway is action recognition, analogous to the ventral pathway for object recognition. And it's also organized in a very similar manner, namely along two main dimensions. So the posterior-anterior gradient that I just mentioned before, from perceptual action precursors to conceptual action representations, and a dorsal-ventral distinction that segregates animate and inanimate action aspects, which mirrors the organization of the ventral pathway for object recognition. Now, this proposal is similar to another account, which has been proposed by Pitcher and Angerleider, who argue for a right lateralized pathway that is specialized for social perception and in particular for body-related and emotion-related information, such as moving faces and bodies. Now, by contrast, many other action-related representations, for example, of hands and tools, are found only in the left hemisphere. It's important to keep in mind. So it seems that left and right lateral pathways likely have different but complementary functions. So the primary function of the left pathway would be action recognition, whereas the right pathway might be more specialized for processing perceptual cues that are important for other social functions like mentalizing. So to conclude the first part, left anterior LOTC encodes the conceptual stage in action recognition, And the final stage of this pathway, and this is the final stage of this pathway from conceptual representations in the LOTC. So I think it's a nice model, but now what are then the frontal and parietal cortex doing in action recognition? So as I've explained before, usually people associate these frontal-parietal regions with motor-related representations and with the inference of action goals and intentions. And by contrast, these regions are also involved in visuospatial processing, in predictive processing of dynamic events, and in physical inference. So the former group of functions apply to dynamic, are specific for actions, whereas the latter functions are more general, so they apply to events in general. So an important question is therefore, how specific are the representations in frontal-parietal cortex, and actually also in the action observation network in general for action recognition. So let's move to the next part. In this study with Seda and Alfonso, we compared the decoding of actions. So in this case, a person kicking a box, or jumping over the box, or just walking. And here you can see already the results, so there's nothing surprising. So again, just robust decoding in the expected areas in the LOTC and frontal-parietal cortex. This we compared now with the decoding of object events. For example, a ball hitting against a box, or bouncing over it, or just rolling in front of the box. Now, importantly, these object events are structurally matching the human actions. So there's the same kind of interaction or spatial relation between the moving entity and the box. And as you can see, the three events can be decoded in the same action observation network. So you might wonder whether there are actually some differences. You might see them already here in the LOTC. And we can also compute a contrast between these two decoding maps to explicitly test for differences. Now, as you can see, there's only one single large region, the right LOTC, extending into the PSDS, showing a higher sensitivity to decode actions as compared to the decoding of object events. So there are also some other regions that show some trends, such as the left PSDS and the fusiform gyrus, which makes sense as they are both associated with the processing of body parts and movements, as well as the SPL. However, we found no differences in the premotor cortex and in the IPL. And I think this is super surprising, so we didn't expect to find such a strong lack of differences. Now, for an even more sensitive test, we compared the decoding accuracies in a region of interest analysis, which again shows stronger decoding for actions in the right LOTC and bilateral SPL, but no significant differences in premotor cortex and IPL. So this surprisingly high sensitivity to both actions and inanimate object events, which lack any body-related information in the stimulus, why are they so different? So are there distinct but anatomically overlapping representations for actions and object events, or is there a common representation? Now, because the actions and object events are structurally similar, we can test for a common underlying representation using cross-decoding. So we trained the classifier on the actions, and then we tested it on the object events. And as you can see, throughout the action observation network, there are common representations that generalize across agency. Now, are these common representations capturing perceptual aspects? For example, broadly similar trajectories, or the visuospatial relations between the moving entity and the target object? Or are they rather capturing conceptual aspects, that is, the semantic core that is shared between, for example, hitting and kicking, irrespective of whether the agent is human or an object? Now, fortunately, we can even answer this question because we presented not only action videos, but also sentences of the action and object events. So again, what we did was to train the classifier on the action videos, but now we tested it on the sentences, and this should now isolate the representations that generalize across both agency and stimulus modality. And here's what we found. Now, the significant effects were largely restricted to their anterior LOTC, overlapping with the cluster that we have found just for cross-modal action decoding. So, although I must also mention that region of interest analysis also found some significant effect in the IPL. Okay, so that was really a lot of findings. Let's quickly summarize them. So, most of the action observation network are actually similarly sensitive to actions and object events, and they contain common representations of actions and object events. So first, the left LOTC encodes modality general, conceptual representations of events, whereas other action observation network regions encode modality specific, that means more perceptual representations. Now, what exactly might these perceptual representations actually capture? So, and I think one exciting interpretation is that they encode the core structure of the events. For example, how entities move relative to or impact on a target object. Okay. So, by contrast, only few regions of the action observation network, namely right LOTC and bilateral SBL, are more sensitive to human actions. So these regions might have more specific roles in processing biological motion and perhaps other action-specific aspects. Why can't I go on? Sorry, okay. So this concludes the second part of my talk. Yes, so right LOTC and SPL appear particularly sensitive to actions, whereas other action observation network regions are equally sensitive to inanimate events. Now, in the final part of my talk, I would like to present you some more recent studies that aimed at testing for the existence of structural action representations more directly. Specifically, we hypothesized that the parietal cortex, in particular the anterior IPL, is a key region for this type of representation. So why? Well, remember that action representations in AIPL generalize across perceptually highly variable exemplars, from opening bottles to opening doors and trash bins. But AIPL does not meet the other key criteria for conceptual representation. So how can we explain this remarkable representational profile? Well, what all of these actions have in common is the core structure of the effect that is induced by the action, namely how an object changes its state from closed to open. Now, the recognition of this stage builds on processing of visospatial and temporal relations. So importantly, how do entities or entity parts, for example, the door and the door frame, spatially relate to each other, and how do these spatial relations change over time? Now, often there's no clear relationship between an object change and the specific means. For example, certain body movements, how the object change is induced. For example, we can open a door by pushing or by pulling the handle, depending on which side of the door we are standing on. So this suggests that the body movements and the effect they induce are, at least partially, independent from each other. And as we have seen in the last study, not only the LOTC, but also the SPL seems to be particularly tuned to body movements. That's also in line with the finding that point light displays, which show only body movements but no visible effect on objects, are also decoded particularly in the SPL, but less so in the AIPL. So here we tested the hypothesis that body movements and the effect they induce are distinctly processed in the SPL and in the IIPL. Okay. So how did we do this? Well, again, we used cross-decoding. So this is me breaking a stick. And here we have an abstract animation that is perceptually very different, but we can still recognize the effect that is induced, namely dividing a circle. Now, what we can do is to train a classifier to decode the action and then test it on the structurally matched animations. And this way, we isolate the representations of action effects independently of body movements. Now, we can also do kind of the reverse thing, namely to use point light display stick figures of the actions for testing the classifier. And this would isolate the representation of body movements independently of a visible interaction with objects. So we first tested whether IIPL is sensitive to action effects. So we trained the classifier on actions and then tested it on the matched animations and vice versa. And as you can see, the cross-decoding was stronger in the left and right AIPL, so shown here by the bars in red, compared to the SPL. Now, then we tested whether the SPL is particularly tuned to body motion, and for this we tested the classifier on the point light displays, and we found the opposite pattern, namely that the decoding was stronger in the SPL compared to the SPL in both left and right hemispheres. So SPL and AIPL show a double dissociation in representing body motion and the effects they induce. We also ran a searchlight analysis which revealed effects in line with the ROI analysis, namely that action effect decoding peaked in the AIPL, whereas body motion peaked in the SPL, and also as expected in the LOTC extending into the PSDS. Now, interestingly, action effects appear also to be represented in the LOTC. And both in AIPL and LOTC, the effects are stronger in the right hemisphere. So why are they right lateralized? So that was absolutely not expected to us, but actually there is some evidence that estimating the effects for physical events, for example, of colliding balls, is indeed associated with stronger activation in the right hemisphere. And by contrast, object manipulation and tool use, or more generally how an effector interacts with and changes an object, is more left lateralized, in particular in the AIPL and in the LOTC. Now, importantly, our abstract animations differed only in terms of the effect, the object change. So, for example, here we see them dividing, compressing, and so on, whereas the way of how the entities interact with each other, so the cause, is actually the same in all animations. So now we had this really crazy idea and wondered, can we actually go on one step further and dissociate representations of the interaction and the effect that is induced by this interaction? So we designed another experiment in which we again used actions, for example, squashing a plastic cup, for training the classifier, and structurally matched animations for testing the classifier, like this triangle compressing a rectangle. Now, importantly, we also created two additional animations. In these animations, we either showed only the first half of the animation, namely the interaction, without any effect on the object, and the animations that showed only the object change in isolation without the triangle that induces this change. So here you see a full overview of the stimuli. So we first showed the interaction-only animations in which a triangle makes contact with the object from the top or from the side or with a flat or sharp side. Then we had the object change-only animations in which the rectangle changes its location or shape. And finally, the full animations, and in the last session, the corresponding actions. So the order was chosen here to minimize learning effects. And also, I would like to emphasize that we used a very high stimulus variance, actually like in all experiments that I presented to you today, including left-right flipped versions to rule out confounds due to lateralization of the stimuli. And then, again, we did the cross-decoding. So let's start with the replication of the previous effects. So we decoded between actions and animations, but this time with the change-only animations that entirely omitted an interaction between the object. And so what we found, as predicted, the representations of the object change can be decoded better in the right AIPL and LOTC compared to the left. Now, then we did the cross-decoding between actions and the interaction-only animation. And as predicted, this revealed the opposite pattern. So effects were stronger in the left as compared to the right hemisphere, although this difference was significant only in the left LOTC and only marginally significant in the AIPL. But this pattern was also corroborated by a searchlight analysis. So again, we find that the change-only cross-decoding revealed effects in the left hemisphere, so specifically in the left LOTC and in the left SPL, so not in the AIPL as expected. Whereas the change-only cross-decoding revealed stronger decoding in the right hemisphere, so in particular in the right parietal cortex and the LOTC. So this replicates the effects of the previous study. Now, remember that we also showed the full animations. And perceptually, the full animations are just like the sum of the animations that show only the interaction and the change in isolation. However, only the full animations show actually the two components together. Namely, so these two components are connected through a cause-effect relation. So in other words, the combination of interaction and change is more than the sum of its part. And the comparison of the cross-decoding with the full animations allows us actually to test whether there are brain regions that are particularly tuned to these cause-effect relations that integrate these two components. So what we did now was to compare the cross-decoding between action videos and full animations, so shown here for the AIPL, with the sum of the cross-decodings that we did with the interaction-only and the change-only part. So basically the results that I've shown you already. Right? So here you see the decoding accuracies stacked onto each other. And as you can see, the decoding with full animations is much stronger than the sum of the interaction and change decoding in isolation. Now, we also tried a different approach in which we first averaged the neural activation patterns of the interaction and change-only animations, and then we did the decoding with the actions. And basically, this revealed the same significant difference. And importantly, this difference between the full animations and the averaged patterns is much weaker in the LOTC. So it's still significant, but there's a clear interaction between the brain regions. So we can also do this in the whole brain. And as you can see, both approaches of this super additivity analysis overlap in the anterior IPL. Okay, so to summarize these two studies, we found evidence for structural representations that capture first the broad type of effect, the change that is induced by an action, for example, a change of shape, change of location or configuration. And these representations are right lateralized in IPL and LOTC. Secondly, the broad type of the interaction, that is how an effect exerts a force onto an object, appear are more left lateralized. However, the effects were much weaker, and so more work is needed to replicate these findings. And also, here we focused on actions directed toward inanimate objects. And it would be interesting to test to see whether there are actually also similar structural representations for other kinds of actions, like social actions or actions that induce a change of location, like running and climbing. So finally, AIPL appears to be particularly sensitive to the integrated representation of interaction and change. And this points toward a particular role of the AIPL in representing the cause-effect relation in goal-directed actions. So this answers the third question. Yes, there is evidence for structural representations, and it appears that they rely on the AIPL, but interestingly also on the LOTC, although the cause-effect relations seem to rely particularly on the AIPL. So now let's go back to our initial question. What can we conclude about the action observation network? So the first take-home message is that, well, there is not really a clearly circumscribed network that is specifically dedicated to action recognition. So most parts are actually equally sensitive to inanimate events. So that's a little problem. So should we still use the term action observation network? So I think that may be fine. So I think it's just a comprehensive label to describe the network of brain regions that is just important for action recognition, but we should keep in mind that actually these are not specialized regions for action recognition. Now, what specifically have we learned about these regions? So first, I hope I've convinced you that there is a lateral pathway in the left LOTC from perceptual action precursors to conceptual action representations and event representations. And also right LOTC contains such a pathway, but this pathway seems to be more tied to perception, in particular to the perception of socially relevant dynamic information. And it's also more sensitive to human actions as opposed to object events. Also, the SPL is more sensitive to actions than to object events, and in particular to body movements. However, body movements are perceptually more complex than object movements, so it might actually be that the SPL is sensitive to complex motion patterns in general. So this is still an open question that remains to be tested. The AIPL we propose encode structural event representations that capture the specific temporal-spatial relations of the elements that are important for action recognition. And it seems particularly sensitive to a more integrated representation of cause-effect relation. We have also seen that it is possible to disentangle the interaction between entities, that is a type of contact, from the effect, that is the induced object change, for example, a change in location or shape. And we have seen that the effect representations are strongly right lateralized, not only in AIPL, but actually also in the LOTC. However, in LOTC, this seems to capture more just the state change of an object. So it seems that right LOTC is not only sensitive to the dynamics of body-related stimuli, but also to the dynamics of objects in general. By contrast, how objects or entities in general interact with each other draws more on left lateralized regions, in particular in the left LOTC. So now I was quite silent about the role of the premotor cortex. So now this is simply because I did not really find clear effects and dissociations in the premotor cortex, at least for the paradigms I've tested so far. Now, in general, the premotor cortex appears to be more sensitive to action kinematics, but the precise function of premotor cortex in action recognition, I think, is still relatively unclear. So it has been argued that premotor cortex is important for generating predictions of unfolding dynamic events, but it's also equally clear that premotor cortex encodes motoric information about actions. And there's absolutely no doubt that motor information can be activated by observing actions. So a straightforward interpretation could be that these visual-motor associations are critical, for example, for social and motor learning. But there's clearly more work needed to characterize the representational profile in the premotor cortex. So now coming back to the distinction between AIPL, which encodes perceptually more invariant structural representations, and the SPL that encodes more specific representations of body movements. So we have learned this actually already this morning, namely this dissociation resembles a proposal that the dorsal warehouse stream is subdivided into two substreams, a dorsoventral pathway for more general mechanical knowledge about how tools can be used to manipulate objects, and the dorso-dorsal pathway for more specific visual motor coordination of body movements. Now, our finding actually appears in line with this framework, and I think it does make sense because both action recognition and execution require a physical analysis of how the body should move and interact with objects to induce a change in them. For example, when I want to squash a plastic cup, I have to estimate the physical properties of that cup. So its material properties, whether it's rigid or soft, to predict what effect it would have if I hit it with my hand. And the same physical analysis should occur also in your brain when you observe me doing this action. So, and as recently proposed by Jason Fisher, this shared neural process actually offers an interesting novel interpretation for the function of mirror neurons. Okay, so I would like to end with a more general thought on the question whether it is actually possible to find out the format of representation. So Alex Martin discussed this issue in a paper in 2016 and asked, is conceptual information stored in an abstract, amodal, language-like propositional format? Or is it stored in a depictive, iconic, picture-like format? And later he concluded, the problem, however, is that we do not know how to determine the format of a representation. So here I would like to argue that cross-decoding might actually offer an account to address this question. And in the case of action representation, perhaps both types of representation might exist. So a conceptual, perhaps more propositional representation in the left LOTC, and a structural, more iconic representation that is more distributed in bilateral LOTC and IPL. And that's it. So I would like to thank all the people who helped me with this research, like Alfonso and Angelica, the students who ran more recently the studies with me and my current lab. And also please check out Marisa's poster today and listen to Ingmar's talk tomorrow, where we actually talk about, they will talk about something very different, namely dynamic RSA. And of course, thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So we have time for questions. Do we have a microphone runner? Or is there?
Ah, sorry, yeah. Here you go.
In the back.
Thank you, Moritz. Beautiful talk. I'll go back to the end of your slide. So this one, like about the format of representation. I was just wondering, like, how can you rule out the fact when you say, like, okay, when I use sentences, I go to the propositional, the more linguistic, conceptual aspect of things. How do you rule out the intermediate visual imagery factor, for example, that when you read a sentence, you picture in your mind the action?
Yes. That's a good and important question. So I think from the cross-decoding between action videos and sentences alone, we cannot rule out this, this interpretation. But I think the comparison between different cross-decoding schemes, this allows us actually to at least get a feeling for the ratio, let's say, between these effects. So to just give you an example what I mean. So here it could be that also structural representations are activated, or as you said, that visual imagery of the action might explain these findings. But when we now compare the cross-decoding for the between actions and videos, action videos and sentences, with the cross-decoding between actions and these more perceptual stimuli, then we see a very different pattern. So unfortunately I didn't show it here that in the left hemisphere the effects are much, much weaker, right? So, and therefore I think it may be, yes, in both cases you also activate the other type of representation, but you kind of change a bit the strength of the effects on one side or the other. And this, I think, makes these effects interpretable.
Thank you. If I may, just that I have the mic, a second question. You have centered your talk on actions involving kind of interaction between object and agents, right? So what about like actions that do not involve that, like you know, walking, running? Are they activating the same network? And how much an action can be metaphorical? So basically, I can open a bottle, but I can also open my mind to your ideas or my heart to you, whatever. Can it be as metaphorical as that, an action?
So I think there are two questions. So one is about more different action categories, like locomotion actions, like walking and running. So I would say that yes, again, there may be also more abstract but still structural representations, how namely an object's move relative to an anchor point, right? So to a surface or to a target to where you're running at. I mean, we have seen in the Haidar and CIMeC animations that it works even for actions that almost show no movement, like mental actions and perception actions, right? We can even infer this by just analyzing the specific visuospatial relations between the different elements. So I would argue that the same structural perceptual representations are important here too. But that needs to be tested. So far, as you said, so I mostly focused on changes in shape or on configuration or change in position. And so to your second question, well, it's an idea I always had since many years actually, namely to also test whether there are representations that generalize to more metaphoric actions like opening your heart or opening your mind. I don't see any reason not to believe that this may be the case. No? Of course, this works only for cross-decoding. Well, that you can't cross-decode it, so you can only then present descriptions of that action. So at least I cannot imagine opening a heart. And of course, you can have a surgeon, but I think the meaning is something different.
Hi. So I wanted to ask, since you invited me, I want to give my contribution from the wet side of neurophysiology. You use several terms that we also use to representation, encoding, sensitivity are the three that I can remember most immediately. So when we deal with this concept, we may, for example, if I think of sensitivity, I basically think to the input, so to LFP modulation would reflect the synaptic input from other areas in the area that I'm studying that not necessarily correlate with the spiking output in terms of neuronal activity, which is the typical concept that you use to refer to encoding. Neuronal population or single cell encode something. If they vary, there is discharge typically increasing or even decreasing their activity depending on the stimuli. So I was wondering how and whether this concept can be included in this basically framework where, for example, you have several sensitivities to stimuli that are ultimately visual in visual areas, and how much of this can actually depend on the way you are testing, what you would expect that these neurons, the neuronal population within this voxel are doing. Is it relevant for you? No, and why?
Yeah, of course, I cannot test it with fMRI, no? So we can now just look into a bunch of voxels, and even not in specific voxels, but rather in a brain region. So I have no idea whether these are due to excitation or due to some, yeah, let's say more local computations, or due to some activation from input or output processes. And so I would argue that at least for the relatively narrow question that I asked, it is probably irrelevant. No? So I just wanted to clarify a little bit what these different brain regions are representing. So can we differentiate, disentangle different types of representations? Again, I think we cannot entirely rule out that there are some representations that we did not attempt to decode, but still we also included in our decoding. So the relative contributions, I think, are important here. So, but I think, so with this general framework of decoding, trying to isolate a specific type of representation, it can allow us to inform a more general model. A little bit like the idea that we then developed that the left LOTC contains the pathway from more perceptual to conceptual representations. So I think on this level we might be able to make some conclusions.
I think it was my turn, but I'm happy to pass over afterwards. Thank you, Moritz. Beautiful set of studies. I have a follow-up study on the question that Olivier asked before. So I'm wondering to which degree the representations, and this also goes, is related to the problem you're putting here on the slide, how strong are these effects depending on the kind of tasks that the participants are engaged with? You mentioned at some point the use of catch trials, but I'm lacking detail. So what kind of task are they engaged with, and could the kind of task they are engaged in prime them or facilitate them to translate whatever they're seeing into some symbolic representation, and then so make it less surprising that you find some cross-modal representations just because of the task? You see my point?
Yeah. So short answer is the effect is huge. So I did not show you that study yet, but I ran actually an experiment where we specifically aimed at testing a higher level representation that actually follows action recognition. So, okay, first let's answer the question on what exactly did we do in our tasks. So in the beginning, we just had some catch trials where we showed an additional action, kind of an oddball action, and in those cases they had to press a button. So this aimed at ensuring that they, well, not only attended to the stimuli, but also try to recognize, is it opening, is it closing, or is it a third action that actually is not related to the actions of our interest. Later for these animations, we used a more basic task, and basically we just showed a little glitch in our 2-second long video. So we shuffled the frames a little bit. And this was done because we can use this task for all of our different sessions in parallel. So the task was equally difficult. Of course, this way they did not really have to understand what's going on, but at least they have to look not only at the video, but also on the specific movement of them.
But what did they have to do during the sentence processing?
Sorry?
During
the sentence processing, we had some grammatical or semantic errors. So for example, the boy jumps the chair, for example. And then, so this again ensured that they read and understand the sentences. Now, coming back to your question, so if we now ask a higher level task, and again we can use sentences of the girl opens the pizza box, but now this time we explicitly ask them to infer the intention of the action. So perhaps because the girl is hungry. Yeah? So and then occasionally we can ask these kinds of questions. So is the girl angry? And the answer would be no. Is the girl hungry? In another catch trial, the answer would be yes. So this way, in order to answer these questions, it's not sufficient to just understand the sentence up here to the recognition to the endpoint of the recognition process, but actually also requires a higher level integration and the higher level inference of the mental state. Now we can show videos of people opening pizza boxes and bottles and show sentences, do the same cross-decoding as before, and remember we found only the left LOTC for cross-decoding between sentences and videos. But if you use this higher level task, then a much, much larger network shows this cross-decoding, including the theory of mind network. So the effect is, of task is very important. Did you even
cannot take
listen to my answer? Okay.
Moritz, thank you for taking my picture off the screen.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that. So now go back to it.
All right.
So I think your claim was that it points towards right, different representations. I have no argument with that. Matter of fact, we do the same approach, doing the cross-modal integration to see if you can predict one from the other. So just so I understand your argument here, if we do biological motion, people, as you showed, and many of others have shown, you get activity in posterior STS. Mm-hmm. If you have people read sentences about people moving, you get activity in the same region. If we can cross-decode from those sentences to people observing biological motion, are you then going to argue that the perception of biological motion is propositional?
Yeah, that's exactly. So here I focused actually on all the cross-decodings where we took the action video as kind of let's say the anchor, and then we try to pull out the representation. But now, of course, what we could do is take just the other types of stimuli and decode between, let's say, the sentences and just the biological motion. So
trying to get the logic straight. So as I understand it, you would have to argue that, in fact, perception of biological motion is propositional if I can cross-decode from the sentences to the picture.
With picture, you mean the action video, right?
Yeah.
Or between the biological motion, the point light display.
You have just like that.
Yes, okay.
I have a sentence that describes people moving, and I show people moving. And now I get activity in posterior STS. We know that that's true. And I now show that, in fact, I can cross-decode from the sentences to the picture. Are you then going to argue that perceiving biological motion, that is people in motion, is propositional in its format?
Oh, I'm still not entirely sure whether I understand
and the answer from Alfonso
is So you argue
yes.
that because this is overlapping with the PSDS, and PSDS is associated with biological motion, this means that it's arguing against a propositional representation? I'm sorry, so I think we have to later talk about it.
So you're not getting off the hook, because I have exactly the same line of questions too from Angelica and Alex. I was curious, because it seemed to me, if you want to argue for conceptual representations, that you only tested half your hypothesis, and you have to show it in the other direction. And so I'm curious if you, the cross-modal decoding. So if, like on the example on the right there is really nice. So do you get the same pattern if you start with the shapes and then you generalize to the videos? Okay,
you mean just the order of the decoding, you mean? Well, it has no effect. So in most cases, so we sometimes observe a significant difference between, so what we can do, as you said, we can either train the classifier on videos and then test it on the sentences, or vice versa, right? And for this case, we did not find any differences between the two.
And also for
sometimes we find effects, but they are strange and hard to interpret. Why? So we find effects not in, for example, the ARPL, but sometimes they are in the early visual cortex, sometimes in the premotor cortex. So I did not really find a clear systematic, let's say, interpretable pattern of these different cross-decoding schemes. So to just give an example, so we had this study where we had 3 different types of animations: the full animations, change-only animations, and interaction-only animations, and then the action videos. So now we have 3 different action to animation cross-decoding, and so we would assume that a systematic effect should emerge for all types of the animations, but that's not the case. So sometimes the effects are stronger if we start by training the classifier on animations and then test on the videos, but sometimes they're also stronger the other way around. So I wish I could give you a clear interpretation or explanation for these effects, but I don't have them. So, and in most cases, we don't find any differences at all.
But so, just to follow up on that, I mean, so if you're essentially ignoring situations where you don't get effects in the expected regions, then why should we take the effects in the expected regions as evidence that it's truly abstract? Okay, so you mean
why actually does the classifier work in both directions? Well, I mean, so when you train a classifier on action videos, so then the classifier will exploit certain features in order to classify them. In perceptual regions, the classifier then might rely on the perceptual differences between the actions. And then when we test the classifier on the sentences, well, it would simply not work because there are no perceptual similarities between the videos and the sentences, okay? Now you can do the same way around, and again, it would not work. So only if you have a conceptual region where the perceptual features does not really help the classifier to discriminate either the videos or the sentences. So the only available information in that brain region is the conceptual information, and then it should really make no difference. Now, that's the ideal science scenario, and for a region like the left LOTC, this is clearly not the case, because we know that it's not a purely conceptual region. It overlaps also with more perceptual effects.
Which kind of brings me back to the question also is like, well then why is it conceptual? I mean, if the criteria for it being conceptual.
It contains, a brain region can contain different types of representation. So it can contain conceptual representations and in an overlapping manner also contain some neurons that are more specialized for perceptual features.
Sorry, Alfonso, you have one minute. So we just have one. He's going to have fast, and then what? Why 1 minute? We're at time. It's time for the poster session.
This meeting we called it concepts, actions, and objects. And I think some of us thought that the reason we had the word concepts there is because we think that concepts are different from objects and from actions. And so the question is, do people believe that there are such things as concepts? And if there are such things as concepts, then what are they exactly? How do we represent that stuff? Okay? Well, imagine that what I'm saying now, I've been saying it in French. Okay? Now, how do you know that I'm saying the same thing? Now, one way is that you have knowledge that maps one word onto the other. If you have a linear, simple characterization of that sort, perfect. But imagine now I go from this to sign language. What a language that doesn't have the same kind of structures that we have in Italian, Latin language, so we go to Chinese. Okay? Now, all of you, I assume, will have to argue that there is some type of representation that allows for translation. So now extend this to watching a scene. How do I know that that scene and that sentence I'm producing actually captures the same kind of content? I challenge you to come up with an articulation that avoids the notion of concept. So once you're committed to that, then you cannot escape having to make claims about their nature. Now, Olivier says, well, perhaps it's just visual. What does that mean? What is a visual representation? Do we sit here and sort of run this little film every time I hear a sentence? And then you ask me, what did you mean? I have to rerun that film? Or do we have an articulation in terms of stuff we call conceptual? I rest my case.
Did you want to respond
yes, no,
to that?
I think it wasn't a question, no? So
No,
I
it
mean,
wasn't
so
a
you could
question.
argue, well, then for this point, and I agree with it, there's no research needed, no? It's a theoretical argument already, right? So, but...
Okay, no. You had 1 minute. we need to head to the poster session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.